Peter and John were going into the empty tomb, and what Dave covered was 3 different Greek words for the English word see. You guys remember that who were here on Sunday? And it was really, really good. And basically he showed how we have one word for see, but in Greek there were 3, and they give more nuance and detail that helps us understand what the disciples went through in their understanding as well. The first word, I don't remember the Greek word, so if you're wanting that, sorry, you're going to have to ask David. But the first word was sort of to glance at something, and that was what happened when, I believe it was John went in and he saw that the tomb was empty. And then the second word for see was sort of to study or to investigate. And that was, I think, Peter, who he really noticed the claws were lying in a certain manner and there was no body there. And then the third word for see was what I would describe as to know or to understand. And that was, I believe it was John who was the first one to see and understand. And what he did was he looked beyond the particulars of the situation and what did it mean? What did it mean that there wasn't a body there? Well, it meant that Jesus was alive, and John was the first one who believed. So he got that understanding. So I hope when we look at Exodus 12, I want to look at some of the particulars, like how they do how did they select the lamb, how did they perform the sacrifice, what did they do with the blood. So I want to look at all these particulars, but hopefully we can see beyond the particulars to what does it mean? Why did God have them do it this way? And what does that mean for us? And anyway, I think there's a lot here. I didn't realize when I agreed to teach this lesson that it was on this part of Exodus, which is kind of like the whole pivotal part of the whole book, is when they go from slavery to freedom. And I think that was a trick.
It was a trick.
There's so much here. I already felt unqualified in teaching, but there's so much here, so much that happened, and there's so much symbolism that goes beyond just what happened in Egypt several thousand years ago. So anyway, hopefully we can see that. I think this would be a really good point to recap where we've been, because this is kind of a hinge point in the book where, like I said, they go from slavery to freedom. And by the way, it says, I don't know if I have the verse here, but it's toward the end of the chapter where it says they were enslaved for 430 years. So they were more generationally slaves in Egypt than we are Americans. Like, that's how much it was part of their way of life. I mean, almost twice as much time they spent in slavery as we've spent as free Americans. Just sort of get a mindset of how big of a deal this was for them. So, just to recap, and this is important when we see what the 10th plague is, to recall what Pharaoh did previously. So just one of the things is to recap is the sins of Pharaoh. So this is the same Pharaoh that ordered all the male Hebrew babies to be thrown into the Nile. And then we have the story of Moses he kills the Egyptian, he flees, and then he attempts to come back and start a revolution on his own. And it doesn't go so well. And then we have God revealing himself to Moses in the burning bush. And then in God's timing, Moses returns to Egypt. And then Pharaoh, Moses goes to Pharaoh, says, let my people go. Pharaoh says, no, and by the way, I'm going to make everything more difficult for you. So he increases the burden. And then what we've been studying the last 3 or 4 weeks are the first 9 plagues. And this is God being patient with the Egyptians. I think George said last week, he could have just come in and just done it immediately, wiped out the Egyptians, brought the Jews out, but he didn't. He was patient over and over. And we have Pharaoh's hard heart where he says, okay, you can go. Wait, never mind, come back. And then the last verse in chapter 11, right before we get to chapter 12, this is after right before the Passover. It says in verse 10 of chapter 11, Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go out of his land. So one of the things I think this teaches us is that signs will not save. Signs will not convince anyone. I sort of have a slightly unhealthy obsession with watching debates between like atheists and Christian. And most of the time I don't think they're very productive, but I was watching one a couple weeks ago, and the atheist in the debate was just continually saying to the Christians, show me, show me, show me. He even brought to the debate a gallon of antifreeze, and he poured some in a cup, and he wanted some believer in the audience, take a step of faith, drink the antifreeze is deadly and poisonous, and he wanted them to do it. He was demanding a sign, and I think we can see throughout history, not just here in Egypt, but also in Jesus. Jesus himself raised someone from the dead, and still they did not believe. Even the disciples struggled to believe after that. So I think one of the things that the first 9 plagues teaches is that signs don't save. In fact, they further hardened Pharaoh's heart. All right, so I've struggled to determine how much of this I'm going to read, because chapter 12 is quite a long chapter. But I'm not going to necessarily go through it chronologically, because there's sort of some back and forth between God giving the direction to the Israelites, and then later in the chapter they'll do what he commands. So it's not perfectly linear, like talking about the different subjects. So I'm going to take it by topic. And you can see in your sheet there, oh, by the way, I tried to reduce the number of blanks from last time, because that was a little much. So the first one we covered is that God is faithful even when we were not. And I think we covered that actually last time that I taught about the just the generational faithfulness of God to the people of Israel leading up to the Exodus. But I want to read this first 28 verses of chapter 12. And if you've grown up in the church, you've heard this story probably hundreds and hundreds of times, maybe even read it hundreds of times. So it's good to try to kind of clear our minds and read it for the first time if we can, because there's a lot here, and sometimes it's easy to get stuck on one of those first 2 steps of seeing and never going beyond just the particulars of the passage and seeing beyond what just the bare facts. So I'm going to start with verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their fathers' houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make an account for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorsteps and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. As a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the 7th day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone prepared by you. And you shall observe the feast of the unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwelling places you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts. The Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, What do you mean by this service? You shall say, It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the people of Israel went and did so, as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. So we're going to get into the lamb, but the first thing that's interesting is this event is so major, they changed their whole calendar and the way they keep track of time based on this event. So this is already getting into the sort of the comparisons between this and Christ. So how do we base our calendar? On the resurrection of Christ. Okay. So this was as big of an event at that time to the Jewish people as Christ is to us. It changed their whole calendar. Their calendars, the Hebrew calendar is different. It's not it is on perfectly on lunar cycles and not as ours is, which it doesn't always match lunar cycles. So our calendar is not exactly the same, but they redated the beginning of the year based on this. And then there's specifics about the day of the month that this starts, but we'll get into that in just a minute. So the lamb, I chose this picture on purpose because this is probably a little bit of something that happened, right? Because they were to take the lamb in on the 10th day, and the sacrifice didn't occur. They didn't kill the lamb until the 14th day. So they were getting used to this, and then they had to kill it. And we're going to get into the sort of the similarities between, you can see if you've turned over your sheets. We'll get to that at the end, the comparison of Christ and the lamb. But there was a reason they were doing this. Was all a foreshadowing of Christ. The other thing, it was sized according to the household, meaning it was exactly enough that they needed. Not too much and not too little. There was nothing that was to be wasted. And then it was, of course, without blemish. It was a male, and it was a year old. So basically, in the prime of its life, perfect as perfect as they could get it. And then the actual sacrifice that occurred. So it was killed at twilight. We'll get into the significance of that, of darkness and how that accompanies death. Twilight was the time of day immediately before the end of, right as the sun was going down. The blood was spread on the doorpost using hyssop, and hyssop is a biblical theme with hyssop. From the 51st Psalm, this is a Psalm of David's confession. He says, "Purge me with hyssop, and I will be clean." So hyssop signifies cleansing. And that's what it's a branch of a bush, and that's what they use to spread the blood on the doorpost. That was the takeaway that I listed here, was that it's not enough that they had to make the sacrifice, but they had to apply it and partake of it. So that sort of speaks against the idea of universalism, that Christ died and all will be saved because Christ died. No, they had to not only kill the lamb, but they had to eat the lamb and they had to apply the blood to the doorposts. The other thing, I wasn't brave enough to put it on the sheet because I don't know, but it says, I think I've got a note there. Yeah, they had to roast the flesh. They couldn't eat it raw. They couldn't eat it boiled. Does anybody know why would that be a command? George, you might know an answer. I don't have an answer. I'm just asking. Does anybody know why they had to eat it roasted and not? I mean, for one, it could have been a sanitation thing to keep them from contracting disease. I think the other thing is that it was only what had been through the fire had the ability to save them, to give them life. It had to be put through the fire first.
Whenever they was, when they did the tabernacle in the wilderness, didn't they roast the sacrifices? They didn't boil them, they had it fixed where they roasted over open fire. So it must be pretty significant if it was during that period, because that was a picture of what was to come. And this is a picture of what was to come. Could that be a correlation there?
It could, yeah. I think all of the sacrifices were burned.
Yeah.
Fire was a key component in the worship.
And barbecue's better.
Yeah, I wouldn't want boiled lamb. Or definitely not raw lamb. But I guess before we go even further, what does it mean to sacrifice? What's the word sacrifice mean? I know just being raised in the church, I just sort of accept that word. Oh yeah, we need a sacrifice. What does that even mean? We need a sacrifice.
It means substitution, doesn't it?
A substitution?
Mm-hmm.
To give up something, yeah. So that's sort of the generic word, non-churchy definition of it, to sacrifice, is to give up something. And the idea is that it would be better if I do without something now and have something better later. That's the idea of sacrifice. That's why we go to work, right? I would rather give up my comfort just laying around at home, because it's going to be better for me in the future if I go to work and don't get fired. Well, that's the idea of the sacrifice. They were giving up their, a food that they could have used in another way. They're giving up their what was comfortable to them to go for something better. And this is all God is calling them to faith. Going back to my unhealthy obsession with debates. One of the things is, as Christians, do we have blind faith? Is our faith blind?
No.
Is that a yes or no answer? What does it mean?
It can't be a yes or no, because there's times my faith is, I don't even think about it, I believe it. And there's other times that I'm like, I want to believe it, but don't wholly believe it.
Okay. What does it mean to be blind?
Can't see.
Can't see. So there's definitely an aspect of our faith that is blind. We do not know the future, right? So I think it's important if someone asks you, so you just have blind faith. You have to define what you mean by blind. And you have to define what you mean by faith. The reason I bring this up is because God was not calling them to a blind faith. He was calling them to go somewhere where they couldn't see, and to do something that they didn't know exactly the way it was going to play out. But he gave them plenty of good reasons to believe it. The interesting thing is, this is the first time in all of these plagues that God required the Israelites to do something ahead of time to save themselves. So God's protection in the previous plagues wasn't based on some pre-requirement of the Israelites. He just sovereignly protected them. And this was the first time he said, you need to take a step of faith and do all this weird stuff you've never done before in order to be saved. And he didn't ask them to do that blindly, in that he gave them no reason to believe. They had lots of reasons to believe because he had saved them continually. So going back to the, so yeah, atheists don't like the term faith. And the reason I thought about this is that they say they don't have faith, they have confidence in their beliefs. And when this happened in the debate, the atheist made the point, he said, I don't have faith, I have confidence. And the Christian replied, the word confidence comes from the Latin confide, with faith. So there's no escaping that we all live by faith in some way. And that was the point he was making. You can't believe anything without faith. And then God wasn't calling them to a blind faith that was without any justification, but he was calling them to do something that take a step beyond their comfort zone for sure. The takeaway from the sacrifice, I think I already mentioned it, was we have to apply and partake of it. The one from the lamb, I don't know if I mentioned that. Payment for sin requires perfection. All right, preparation. You got anybody know what this picture's from? Oh, yes. And he was a Boy Scout, and their motto is be prepared. So that's why I put that there. So, this is from verse 11. This is where they're told they've got to have their belt fastened, the sandals on their feet, their staff in their hand. You shall eat, and it says they have to eat in haste. So they had to be prepared to move. And I think that's a good picture of our salvation. So God saves us where we are, but we better be ready to move. Something George mentioned over and over in his sermons is we're called to repentance, meaning we got to move from this way to this way. And that was the first thing that happened. As soon as God freed them, they had to leave. They had to move. They had to be ready. They were to leave with unleavened bread, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that when we get to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But that was a signifying that they were leaving something behind. Actually, I knew they didn't have yeast in those times, but I studied a little bit, and does anybody know what they used to leaven their bread?
Soda, actually.
Actually, I don't know what it started, but I knew the method that they used. I don't know what the actual ingredient, but what they did was they used fermented dough, and it was left from the previous, so they take last week's fermented dough and mix it in with this week's bread, and that would leaven. What's that?
Sourdough.
Sourdough. That sounds like sourdough. But I thought that was a great picture of they had to leave behind. They couldn't continue that. There was something they had to leave in Egypt. And I think that's a picture of us leaving behind sin when we come to faith in Christ.
They still do that. I mean, doing Passover.
What's that?
I said doing Passover in 2000. There were several of us there. I was Jesse's roommate. So, but we were in a hotel, and every drawer in the hotel was pulled out, emptied, and cleaned, looking for yeast or to be sure there was no leavening in the building. And they were very serious about it.
Yeah, and I mean, you could understand why, because even in the passage I've read, I can't remember how many times, I didn't count them, how many times it said, do not have any leaven, get rid of the leaven. And I think that's a picture of how we as believers cannot entertain sin in our life lightly. It's got to be purged out. And there's a New Testament passage, and I thought I had written it down, but I don't have it here, where it talks about how a little bit of a leaven is all it takes to leaven the whole lump. It just takes the littlest bit, and it spreads throughout everything. The interesting thing, this is where, yeah. So we can see that the Israelites had faith, and that comes in verses 27 and 28. And this was the takeaway, is that faith leads to worship and works. And you can see that in verse 27. This was at the end of, so the Passover had not yet happened. They had not yet been saved. Yet it says they listened to what Moses told them from God, and it said the people bowed their heads and worshiped. Then the people of Israel went and did so as the Lord had commanded. So I think those are two evidences of true faith in the life of a believer, as well as what was seen in the Israelites is when they had faith, they worshiped and they obeyed. Which I think is, again, evidence ourselves in our lives. All right. So the actual night of the Passover, we see from verse 12, the firstborn was struck down. And this is a hard one to wrap your head around. Because for one, I don't see any instance, someone correct me if I'm wrong, where Moses was told to share the information about the protection of the blood with the Egyptians. Does anybody know that? I couldn't find that happened. And in fact, it says in verse 30 that there was not an Egyptian house where someone was not dead, meaning none of the Egyptians were saved from this plague. So was it too harsh for God to do that? I mean, I think most of us in here would say no, but what I want is why? Why was it not? That's because this is a struggle for some believers. It'll lead believers to liberalism, like meaning that was a different God. That's not what God really is like now, meaning God can change. This God that killed all the firstborn is not the God that we serve. But we would not say that, right? God is unchanging. God is forever the same. Why is it? It just seems harsh. For one, Pharaoh was the real problem, and he didn't even get, God killed his son. He didn't even hurt Pharaoh. Why?
Well, he gave Pharaoh chance after chance, and he never repented. So, I guess he thought, well, maybe this will make him change his mind.
Yeah, so it's true. This could have hurt Pharaoh more than anything God did directly to him. But what about all the other firstborns? What about them?
All the same bunch.
They're all the same. I
Made a
mean,
real
you can
clear
extend this.
distinction between Egyptians and Israelites.
What's that?
He made a very clear distinction between Egyptians and Israelites.
It's true, yes. And I think that points to, and that's the takeaway, is that God's provision of grace is exclusive. Like there is only one way, and there's nothing but judgment outside of God's only way. One thing that's helped me deal with this idea of God taking what we think as innocent life. And this comes up later in the Old Testament many times, like when the Israelites went to Jericho, the walls came tumbling down. I sang that song growing up in church, but we never sung about what happened right after that, which is every man, woman, child, livestock killed. That's a hard thing to sometimes to wrap your head around. Sort of a story not a story, but just an idea that came to my mind that has helped me is imagine you're in Walmart and you're back at the sporting goods section. And what's right next to the sporting goods section? Toys. So you're at the sporting goods section and you see over at an aisle nearby at the toy, there's a little child, say 5 years old, just standing there, not doing anything wrong. And then all of a sudden, a man comes down the aisle, picks the child up, and hurries away. What just happened?
We don't know.
We don't know. Why don't we know?
We don't know if it's the child's father or the child abductor.
Yes. So you have to know the people to know whether it was something that was lawful or whether it was something horrific, right? You have to know the person. And you have to know more than just the person, you have to know the relationship to the other person, right? Well, it's the same way when we look at God and we want to judge God as if he were us. And if we acted as God acted, I don't like that God. But we are not God, and God is not human. If God, that reminds me of, I heard my father-in-law say this, if you can't get past Genesis 1:1, the rest of this isn't going to help you very much. Meaning if we don't understand who God is, that he's the creator of all life, and that rejection of God is to reject life, right? God breathed life into Adam. And to say I don't want God is to say I don't want life. So we have to understand the person of God to sort of wrap our heads around how God could do something like this and be a good and just God. If he's the giver of life, it was his grace, his continued grace that allowed every breath in every one of those Egyptians, from oldest to youngest. Every single breath they drew was God's grace. So for him to withhold that grace is not unjust.
Yeah, I would just say that everyone deserved to die.
Yes.
The Jews deserve to die. The fact that he would save one Jew, one Israelite, or give the Passover is great grace. And
Just,
so
yeah.
we ask, well, why kill all these firstborn? Why not kill everyone? Everyone deserved death, judgment, and hell, just like in the flood.
You presume
we
that
have to
you deserve
reorient
life.
ourselves and say, what have we done? Well, we've sinned against a holy God. Therefore, what we deserve is death.
Yeah, very good. The interesting thing, Israelites were faithful. This is from verse 28, says this is going back to 28, they did exactly as commanded. So it was I think, like I said, this is a pivotal point in the life of the Egyptians. They demonstrated, or the Israelites, they demonstrated true faith. And then the actual Exodus. So Pharaoh had enough. The interesting thing is, I don't think his heart was changed in any way. He says in, this would have been right after his firstborn was killed. He says, verse 32, take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. Like, he was still wanting something from them. Even as he was kicking them out. He's like, by the way, give me something of what you got. Anyway, I mean, we'll see further that his heart was still hard because he chased after them, and that's the Red Sea story that we'll come to. So the Israelites, they leave in a hurry as predicted, and then also they plundered the Egyptians just as that was also predicted, and they had been commanded to ask the Egyptians, and they basically says the Egyptians were glad to. They had favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and they gave them everything they asked for, which is just fulfilling prophecy from earlier in the book. The interesting thing is it wasn't just the Israelites who left. So I don't think commentators exactly know what it means, but it says that there was a mixed multitude. This is from verse 38. There's a mixed multitude that went up. So likely it was some of the Egyptians, or it could have been some other foreigners. We were told earlier that some of the Egyptians did fear God. That was from one of the other plagues. I can't remember which one it was. So it wasn't exclusive, and I think this is a sort of a foretelling that, back to this, not all who are from Abraham are of the chosen race. It was a blessing for all of the nations, and that continued to grow throughout. As the Israelites spread, they were a blessing to the nations. All right, the remembrance. So this is getting into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The takeaway from the salvation is on the top of that second page, those two blanks. Salvation requires us to leave things behind, but also comes with blessings. So just like the leaven was a picture of what they had to leave in Egypt, they also got the blessing of, first of all, their freedom, but also the wealth that they took from the Egyptians. So the remembrance, first of all, we already covered this. This was from verse 2. This changed their whole calendar. So their whole way of keeping track of time was to remind them of what God had done at this time. And it was to remember it as a feast. So it was a celebration. It wasn't a time for mourning. It was a feast. And it was to be done on a regular schedule with a precise method. So I'm not going to have time to read that, but the first 10 verses of chapter 13 detail exactly how they were to do that and that they were to continue. All right, so I'm going to move through so we can get through this. We've only got 5 minutes. So I want to look at the fulfillment, and we've sort of briefly touched on some of this, but obviously this is a foreshadowing of what? Christ. And Christ is going to fulfill all of these shadows in his death and resurrection, his institution of the Lord's Supper. And I wanted to look at that. I listed them there, so there's nothing surprising. And just the similarities and the contrast between, first of all, we'll cover the Passover lamb and the Lamb of God, which is Christ. So the Passover lamb was selected several days prior to the actual killing of the lamb, just like Christ came into Jerusalem several days before his crucifixion, went into the temple with the people. The lamb lived in the household, just like, and I put references on your sheet. They're not on the screen, but I put them on the sheet for at least the New Testament part. And this is from John, where the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus lived just like a regular human among us. There was to be a lamb for each household, and Jesus was the single Passover lamb for the whole world. Again, that's those references are on the sheet. The Passover lamb was to be an unblemished male in the prime of his life. You know, Jesus was born without sin of a virgin. His death took place in the prime of his life. He was in his early 30s. The bones of the lamb were not to be broken. I didn't read that far enough to get to that point. It was in verse 46. They were instructed not to break any of the bones of the lamb, and we know that none of Christ's bones were broken. And that's a fulfillment of, yeah, there's a passage in Psalms that from Psalm 34:20 that is a prophetic about Christ, and then it's in John, it tells us that none of his bones were broken. And the lamb was to be killed at the setting sun on the 14th day, and we know that Christ breathed his last in the 9th hour, which was about 6 p.m. Is that right? No. No. The 9th hour from 6 a.m. About 3 p.m. Which would have been just prior to the setting of the sun. And the entire congregation was to be involved in the killing, so every household had the lamb. And we know that Jesus, in bearing the sins of the whole world was involved in his killing. And the Passover lamb, its blood prevented death, but that's all it could do was prevent their death. But Christ's blood is what gives us life. So the only thing, the foreshadowing of the Passover lamb was just to cover their sins. It never took them away. It just prevented the judgment of God. And then these are some connections between the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Lord's Supper. So the Passover was instituted by Moses prior to the death of the lamb, just like Christ instituted the Lord's Supper prior to his death. The Passover, it was not for those outside the household. So unless they became part of the Israelites and were circumcised, then they could participate in Passover. In the same way, we fence the table at the Lord's Supper. No one outside the body of Christ should partake of it. Again, the lamb was sized according to the household, and nothing was wasted. Just like Jesus' body and blood is sufficient for the elect. And the removal of leaven is to signify the departure from Egypt. Just like we're called to examine ourselves and repent of sin and departing from the old life and partaking in the Lord's Supper. And that the Passover they were commanded to keep it throughout all their generations, and we're to keep the Lord's Supper until Christ's return. All right, I think that's the end.
What are the blanks under remembrance? God faithfulness, that should be blank and blank.
Remembered and celebrated